Hello and welcome to this session, which forms part of Getting on Board's Trustee Learning Programme. My name is Fiona McCausland, and today we have an excellent session lined up. We're talking about how not to be a prat on a board. We've got fantastic panelists, and before I hand over to Penny Wilson, who is who's chairing this session today, I'm just going to cover some housekeeping. So we'll be recording this session, you notice. You will get access to the recording, and any slides that are used in the session will follow up. The recording may be added to YouTube. Closed captions are available. You'll need to enable these at your end. Please stay muted on the call unless asked to unmute. It helps to make sure that everybody else can hear who's talking clearly. And feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat and tell us why you've come today. Please use the chat to ask questions and share your experiences. We'd love to hear from you, and we think this is a really good session to be sharing your own experiences in. Please keep your comments respectful and useful. And finally, thank you very much to our sponsors, Russell Cook. It's thanks to their support that we're able to make this session and the whole programme free to attend. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Penny Wilson.
Thanks very much, Fiona. So we are here today to talk about how not to be a prat on a board. I'm Penny, I'm CEO of Getting on Board, and I'm going to be chairing our lovely panel here today, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves in a second. So this is obviously a really, really silly title. I came up with it, apologies, but it's a serious topic, isn't it? Poor trustee behaviour is a distraction at best from our organisation's work. And at worst, it's upsetting, it's harmful, and sometimes it's actually terminal for organisations. So this is a really serious topic we're talking about today. Now, I just wanted to say that actually I believe we all have an inner prat as trustees, myself very much included. So we're not sitting here today as chair and panellists thinking that we know it all. We're not sitting on high thinking that we have never been prats. Quite the opposite. So we'll discuss bad trustee behaviour, we'll discuss how to deal with it, and we'll also discuss how to reduce the likelihood of it happening in the first place. Now, as Fiona said, please feel free to use the chat. Please be aware that afterwards, the people who've booked onto this session will receive a recording which has the chat attached to it. Now, obviously, this is a bit of a thorny topic. That chat won't go onto YouTube, but it will be sent round via a Zoom link to registrants. So you may want to consider how you phrase questions and comments with that in mind. Don't hold back, but perhaps anonymise or sanitize. So let's go straight into our questions. And I'm going to come to Pippa first. So Pippa, how would you define prattish behaviour on a board? And panellists, if you could please briefly introduce yourselves before you answer this question for us.
Thanks, Penny, for that introduction to the general topic, as you say, silly but serious. My name's Pippa. I'm a partner in the charity law team at Russell Cook. So I advise charities and trustees where I think trustees have gone beyond prattish behaviour and have actually acted illegally. They've breached their duties. Often that's conflicts of interest, mismanagement, or they've actually, taken some personal financial benefit from the charity when they shouldn't have. But I think, it goes without saying that should be avoided. And I hope we don't have that in a prat within us. This thing we're talking about, prattish behaviour here, again, being a lawyer, I looked up the definition, and the definition is given as acting stupidly or with little ability. And what I actually have found from serving on boards is it's never about intellectual ability or ability. Everyone's got something of value to give as a trustee. And when people act poorly or prattishly, it's almost always about attitude and behaviours rather than anyone not being able to contribute because they're too stupid. So for me, it's about attitude and behaviours and how you work in a group, recognising that a board is a group of trustees and you stand and fall together as a group sometimes. So for me, it's about, and I'm sure we'll go on to talk about this, it's about teamwork, behaviour, attitudes, respect. It's about that type of behaviours rather than ability, raw ability.
Thank you, Pippa. Maybe I should have Googled Prat before I came up with the title. And I'm now wondering if Twit might have been better, but I haven't Googled that either. Fiona, give us an introduction to your background and tell us how you would define prattish behaviour.
Right, okay. Hi, I'm Fiona. After a 30-year career in business, starting in marketing through to international general management, I now have a portfolio of things that I do, some of which is paid business advisory, some of which is being a trustee on different boards, which I found extremely valuable myself, as well as being able to add value. So, well, it's interesting that I didn't Google it either, which is unusual because I Google a lot of things. But I think for me, being a Prat on a board or having Prattish behaviour is something that affects the ability of a board to do their job well, because it actually interferes with the way that a board operates, the board dynamics. And especially so if it shows a form of lack of respect or it affects others on the board. Because actually boards work well if they can work in a collegiate way. That doesn't mean always agreeing, it means working together. And, you know, if you have somebody who exhibits prattish behaviour, it breaks that down. Not just because for them, but for the other people, because knowing how to react or how to behave in that circumstance, it causes barriers, and barriers on board do not aid good communication and good work.
Thank you, Fiona. And Halima, let's come to you.
Hi everyone, Penny, thank you for inviting me to be here. So I'm Halima, currently I'm a grants manager at a local authority, and I've been a charity trustee for almost 10 years for 2 organisations, and I've been chair of trustees for one of those organisations for about, gosh, I think eight or so years. And for me, sadly, I think prattish behaviour is probably more common than we like to admit. And also, sadly, I think we just don't realise. I think a lot of charity trustees just don't. They do, you know, it's done really, it's done without ill intent. But sadly, a lot of us just act in ways that are severely prattish, and we don't realise we're doing it, and we are not called out on it. And I speak from first-hand experience of being a Prat in many occasions and in many ways. And I think for me also, it's about prattish to who? Is it to each other? Because I kind of can be a bit more forgiving when it's maybe between trustees in a closed room. But when it's prattish behaviour to staff, to service users, I think that's when it gets really dangerous. And like Pippa said, can become, you know, where you're no longer using charity resources ethically and responsibly. So yeah, it's something that I think I've learned sadly through experience, both on the receiving end and on being a Prat myself.
Right, and there's a horrible power dynamic as well, isn't there? As soon as it's to staff or to service users or other stakeholders. And we're going to come on to how to deal with this, depending on what position you're in yourself. So Mike, let's come to you now.
Hi, I'm Mike. I guess I've been a Prat many times because I've been in the charity sector. I've worked in the charity sector for just over 50 years, been a chief exec in medium-sized charities, and I'm currently a trustee recruiter for a small organisation here in Berkshire. But I'm also chair of a small charity. I'm chair of a Home Start charity down in North Surrey. What is prattish? I suppose everything that everybody's already said, but to me, it's also behaviour that isn't in the best interest of the charity. Hopefully, doesn't cause too many long-term problems. I think there's worse behaviour than being prattish, but anything that is detrimental to the collective functioning of an organisation has to be defined as prattish. I'm sure we'll get into more serious discussions as we go into that.
Thank you. I'm really interested that you've all mentioned board dynamics and how it affects other people on the board, how it affects other stakeholders, how this is kind of a lot of this is human to human relationships, isn't it? So can you give us an example of some seriously poor behaviour on a board? Mike, let's come to you first.
I thought you might for some reason. I worked with a board of only 3 trustees. This is a while ago. And that was the whole board who refused to actually increase their number. So I think that's the poor behaviour number 1. Despite they'd all been trustees 5, possibly 10 years when I joined the organisation, they didn't understand the operational delivery of the charity, which means that every meeting, the staff had to explain what we do. We provide these services in this way to these people at this time. every time. So any discussion, whether it was strategic or operational, had to be set in context again and again. And the problem there, and the poor behaviour, wasn't just those trustees. Actually, as chief exec, I largely did the governance. It became me doing something, because governance has to go on. Strategy, that sort of future looking work has to go on. And once you get into that switch, it's really hard to get out of it. So it was poor behavior from me, poor behavior from those trustees, and it became self-perpetuating.
So almost trustees not acting as trustees. And
very much so. Yeah, very much so.
Man just stepping into that, to the void. And I guess there's also something there, isn't there, about trustees that do nothing between meetings and think that being a trustee is just pitching up to a meeting and asking some questions and going home again for 3 or 4 months.
And I think it's also about a small number of trustees who are actively against increasing the number of them. They were very cosy.
Interesting, thank you. Pippa, let's hear some examples of seriously bad behaviour from in your experience.
Well, I suppose the seriously bad behaviour, is the type that ends up in front of the Charity Commission, and see, client confidentiality. I will not be sharing my clients' details, but an example would be a trustee that spent £70,000 of the charity's money on an investment in an antique clock, and kept that clock in his house. I mean, that's the type of thing that happens when you've not managed conflicts of interest and the board is not standing up to. Probably there are about 3 trustees, as in Mike's example. I think in terms of board dynamics, some of the seriously bad behaviour that I've seen from afar would be bullying. I have seen, particularly when you have a very strong chair, sometimes that role between board members, but also between the chair and the chief executive of staff, can tip into almost what can be categorized as a bullying relationship. I think, and this is the kind of inadvertent Pratish, but getting the balance right between overstepping the mark and micromanaging the staff, or, as you say, Penny, just I'll come in and ask some questions, and then I'll do nothing in between. So getting that balance. And I think the final example of seriously poor behaviour I've seen, and again, it's all about relationships, so I'm going to borrow some terminology, ghosting. I've seen trustees just ghost a charity and their board. You suddenly don't turn up. Everyone avoids that awkward situation of conversation. I don't have enough time. I can't do this, and think it's okay to just continually not turn up and not do the job. So I put ghosting as my final example of really bad behaviour.
Thank you. And actually, I personally think we make it hard for trustees to leave sometimes, and it almost encourages that behaviour. I'm going to have to slink off because I've not been given an opportunity to have a neat end to my term and leave with my head held high.
Yeah, absolutely.
Halima, let's come to you. Very bad examples. Really.
For me, I think it comes down to the experiences that I've had, especially on the receiving end, is around like kind of founder syndrome. So charity trustees who've set up the charity and have got these fantastic, like, the motivation and the push to make this happen, and have been there and got everyone together. And then once you need to kind of professionalize that charity board and move into kind of the governance and transparency, for me, I've just seen some really awful examples where founders and co-founders have just been continuing to make decisions behind closed doors and present like fait accomplis to a board of trustees who are kind of really just willing to go along with it. And the worst example for me was when a charity board that I had to resign from was where the previous chair had kind of essentially set up who the next chairs for the next kind of decade were going to be. I was essentially just presenting this to the board of trustees, and the newer trustees, who were all women, were saying, hold on a minute, what's going on here? We've not obviously been part of these previous conversations that are happening in the background, and we won't stand for it. And this board of trustees found a way to remove most of those women from that board, and eventually I ended up resigning. So the seriously poor behaviour is dangerous and damaging, and it can cause such, almost like trauma to the people around.
Yeah, and actually in both of your examples, I feel like there's something about people think they own a charity. You know, once you set up a charity, you don't own it anymore, do you? And actually, you know, that can happen with founders, it can happen with any chairs, trustees, it can happen with charity managers. Actually, none of us are immune, but that sense of it's up to me personally to decide what's going on here, which is definitely not what the law says, but is often how it plays out in practice.
Absolutely. And I think that's why, you know, it's good to have, you know, it's really clearly defined terms to be enrolled. And I can feel myself as I've stepped down as chair of the charity that I'm now become kind of a general trustee. And I could almost feel myself becoming like very like, oh my God, this is mine. And having to kind of go, no, time to move on. It's time to step down and, you know, hopefully move on and leave that group as well when it's time.
And I feel like you've just alluded there to a really key, I think, a key principle of not being a prat is having a good word with yourself and checking your own behaviour and just thinking, you know, am I getting this right? And if I'm not getting this right, you know, adjusting the course, doing better next time, and just having some self-awareness. I think that's often missing for many trustees.
Yeah.
Fiona, last but not least, let's hear some really bad examples from you.
I've got one particular bad example of a board that I was on, being careful about what I say, which was a board that consisted of external trustees and students in various roles, and with regular changes of people. And we had the students introducing themselves and explaining what their role was, but also what they were studying or had recently studied. And after the third introduction, a fellow trustee actually said, "Oh, so you're doing a proper degree?" And it was the total lack of respect and understanding. And for me, my amazement that somebody would choose to be in a board with such a mixture of people and express a view like that. I happen to be the chair, so it was dealt with. But I think it goes back to what I said about, and I noticed somebody in the comments picked it up, that I mention respect a lot. That doesn't mean stuffiness. I think in all of our lives, we have to respect other people. We don't have to agree with them, but we do need to respect them. And I do feel, I mean, when we hear on the news and etc. at the moment, that we have changed a little, and that there is less respect sometimes around different people. And we should, as trustees, really ensure, you know, have a chat to ourselves about, are we doing that? And police via the governance whether if people don't. It's important to pick up as well, because it's very interesting. We could probably all have some silly examples. It's very interesting, but we should pick up if there's a problem quickly, not let it sit there.
Absolutely. And yeah, let's pick up a couple of comments in the chat. So Samantha said, you know, disrespect is often at the core, isn't it, of many of these issues. And she said not making the time and effort to understand the role of the organisation, but also not making the time and effort to understand each other and to get to know each other and to respect each other's opinions and backgrounds and so on. And then Fiona said, as you've just been saying, other Fiona, our Fiona, panel Fiona, we're awash with Fionas, checking with others, giving them permission to call us out. So having that kind of culture, creating a team alliance to agree ways of working and continually checking in. I think that's a brilliant set of tips there. Let's
Can I just jump in on it, just to tie a few things, examples together, a common theme. Mike's, his 3 trustees, they didn't want to invite anyone in. Halima, you had the founders who invited others in but didn't include them. And Fiona, the kind of the group of trustees and the students alongside them. I think one of the things we've seen is people going, oh gosh, we must have diversity on the board. Let's have a young trustee. Let's have a user trustee. And then actually not respecting or being inclusive. And I think that's a really, it repeats in a number of different ways, but almost when you have those 2 groups and you're not actually respecting or making an inclusive environment for the type of diversity you brought in, and that's really dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, it's so common, isn't it, to have a kind of 2-tier board where you've got the professional trustees, the experienced trustees, and then you've brought in some people to diversify things a bit, but you don't really care what they say or listen to them or treat them with very much respect at all. They're just window dressing, basically. That's pretty awful if you're one of the people brought in to do that. So let's move on to some of the more common practice behaviour, you know, the stuff that happens all the time that we see in many, many boards, perhaps more minor, but very, very common, and possibly, you know, we've probably done it ourselves. We've certainly all have seen it. So Pippa, perhaps we could start with you. Some examples of really, really common, but more minor practice behaviour.
I mean, I think a rich seam of practice behaviour, which is all relatively new, is how many meetings happen online now and how easy it is to be a Prat when you're online. We've all done it. I'm just going to turn my video off for a second and have a cup of tea. I've got my emails here, but I am still listening. You behave in a way that you would never, ever behave when you are in a room with someone. And it's actually quite disrespectful to only give half your mind to something. And I think we're quite guilty of doing it when we're on a computer screen and we have another screen up with our emails popping up. I think, yeah, just to start us off, I think that's a whole new rich seam of practice behaviour that's come in since COVID, really.
And isn't that kind of part of the practice behaviour of waiting for your turn to speak but not really listening? You know, just sitting there in a meeting and thinking, well, when is it going to be my turn? When's everybody else so that I can have my say? And I think it comes back to what Fiona was saying about, and I'm going to paraphrase what you were saying, Fiona, about, you know, we need to be able to disagree. Like, we need to be able to disagree really constructively and respectfully, but actually we often don't allow ourselves to do that. And I think this not listening is part of that. We've got our entrenched position and we're not willing to budge from it. Fiona, I'm going to come to you next because you're nodding.
Yes, I'd agree with that. I'd sort of thought of four things. The first one is all around knowledge. So people not reading papers for board meetings or committee meetings. You know, they're a sort of a thing that we have. Sometimes they're too long, but they're there for a purpose. And it's really critical. But it's more than that. It's actually that understanding. Somebody else mentioned this. I think it was Halima. Then, you know, not knowing what's going on. And Mike mentioned it too. You need to also read around the background. This is a job. You may not be being paid for it, but it's part of a portfolio of things that you do. You've got to understand the background. The second one picks up a little bit on it's the not listening. And then the reverse of that is talking too much and being aware of that. I'll stop that point there because it's one of the things that I'm a problem with. And I think my third one is about overemphasizing. There are often people involved in charities or boards, maybe founders or maybe a trustee has a particular interest, and they constantly come back to that, even if it's been dealt with. And that's difficult to deal with. And I'm currently a chair, and it's something you have to manage as a chair, but it's their particular interest. And you need to be aware that it's something they either feel strongly about or they're very competent, and manage that process. But that can be very disruptive. And the fourth one is just don't hang around too long. I mean, really, the Charity Commission are very clear. They recommend 2 terms of 3 years, maybe a third, if necessary. I've done a governance review of my current board and brought that in because people were there for at least 12. And it's just too long. It reinforces practice behaviour.
Tell us more about that, Fiona. Why do you think it reinforces practice behaviour?
Because especially if you have that same group of people there that long, they become very familiar. It's very likely, moving on to, you know, the other people involved, that your team, your executive team, if you've got one, however big or small that is, will have changed during that time. And if it hasn't, then the coziness has extended. But when it has, it means that the trustees are like their little band who have always been together. And it's natural. It's like, you know, you've become a little family, and the neighbours have changed and it's you against them. And it creates that kind of thing. And familiarity is not, you need to know people, but it goes back to agreeing too much and not really questioning. And it can lead to that, not always, but it can lead to that. And it's just, people get stale as well. You know, that whole thing, it's the same in, if you're doing new product development, where, oh, we tried that, it didn't work. Well, you know, the world's moved on from 5 years ago or whatever. If you ever say, "Oh, well, we tried that, but it didn't work on a board," that is prattish behaviour. You know, go back and do something about it.
Thank you. Halima.
Yeah, so for me, I think I know the first thing with the previous question was about what are the serious examples of bad behavior. For me, the minor bad behaviors, I think are the more dangerous ones. And I think, it's really easy for a board of trustees potentially to kind of see the bullies on the trustee board, and they'll try and do something about it, or the misogynist, or someone that is really up to the bad stuff and everyone can see it, and people will often set up kind of little side meetings to kind of deal with that behavior. For me, the minor bad behavior is what's really dangerous, and I have been so guilty of this myself. So and I see it now. Why we did this was awful. I was working for the charity, and then I had a baby and decided, okay, I'm going to step out of that role and go back onto the the trustee board. And because there wasn't anyone available, I became the chair of trustees. And I just didn't have the bandwidth. I was a new mum. I just wasn't there. It was during COVID. I didn't have kind of the mental health support that I needed. And I was just so desperate to kind of have something that wasn't kind of being a new mum, that was this kind of being this chair of the charity, that I wasn't available. I just didn't have the capacity, the emotional bandwidth. I say it failing now, and I can say that with kind of, with understanding and with compassion to myself. But it was a really awful situation to put the director in, to put my fellow trustees in, because I'd been a kind of a legacy chair. And so it was difficult, I think, for anyone to be like, oh, Halima maybe shouldn't be in this role anymore. And I realized now it was just a terrible situation to put the organization through. And I thought I was kind of saving the organization and, being this like martyr that was, coming in to continue the chair role. And now I can see I didn't have the capacity. I couldn't say no. I just wanted to kind of create consensus. And so, we stopped having meaningful conversations. We stopped challenging each other. We stopped being able to just disagree in helpful ways, because we were just, it was like kind of that post-COVID, let's just agree and get things done. And so we were just making poor decisions, and I wasn't able to see that was going on, because I just was just looking for somewhere that was kind of safe and validating for myself, and that's not what the charity needed. So for me, I think that's almost more dangerous, because it's really hard to put your finger on what it is that's bad behavior and call it out, because you're dealing with people who are really trying their best.
Yeah.
That's really the hardest thing.
Thank you, Halima. We really appreciate your honesty. And actually, that's going to take me straight into my next question. And Mike, I'll come to you, which is about, and by the way, before this session, I made a list of my confessions, which I'll probably share on LinkedIn rather than here, just because people are here to listen to you. But, Mike, you've promised us, you've said that you're a high-level Prat, an expert Prat. You've got a lot to bring to this conversation. So Halima's kind of shared that this is some of the things that she's looking back on in retrospect and thinking, I could have done better there. What are some of yours? Have you ever behaved like a Prat?
I think, yes.
How might you advise your younger, more Pratty self?
Without a doubt. In fact, it was the first time I was a trustee, and this is really back in the ancient times, back at the end of the 80s, I think it was. And I joined a board, an organisation I knew of, and I was aware of what they did and their public profile. But I didn't have any induction. I didn't have any training. And we know about this a lot in the charity sector. Induction, training, support for new trustees isn't always as good as it should be. Part of what Getting on Board does, part of what my organisation does, is trying to get around that. I joined this board and I said nothing at all for the first year. I went along to the board and there was a plate of samosas at every meeting. So I swear that was my motivation for going along. I went along, I ate my samosas, I said nothing. There was even some outside of the board meeting formality, getting to know other trustees, and I still said nothing. But I didn't complain about the fact that I knew nothing. I just sat there and ate my samosas. And I think the appalling thing about that, the worst part of that behaviour for me as a young trustee, is I was working for another charity and I had a board of trustees, and I probably wasn't training or inducting them as well. So I was replicating that bad behaviour without the samosas, unfortunately, but I was behaving as a Prat, both as a trustee and as a chief officer.
There's a lot there, Mike, isn't there? Because I think that being a Prat is contagious. And particularly if we're new into a board, we assimilate into Prattish behaviour and we replicate it. And that's really, really difficult if you've got no benchmark. If you don't know any other trustees, if you've got no access to other boards, how do you know what's normal? Actually, samosas aren't normal, and that's an excellent idea. So maybe that's a good tip to take away there. And Pippa, let's come to you. Have you been a Prat as a trustee?
Well, interestingly, I was going to give the exact same example as Halima. I was on maternity leave. I didn't want to give up my trustee role, so I was like, it's fine, I can juggle it. First board meeting, I brought my baby along. Chair picked her up and jiggled her. It was all fine. But as the year went on, I really struggled for time. But it was that reluctance to give it up, and I suppose that was me looking at it from the viewpoint of this is my thing, and I want to be able to continue it. Actually, was that in the best interest of the charity? Probably not. I probably made it too personal. I think Mike's, I rarely have the issue of not saying anything, but I think I can be reluctant to ask that stupid question, and almost reveal ignorance. And I think actually, provided that you've read the papers and informed yourself as much as you can, do speak up and ask that stupid question, because it might not be a stupid question. And then I think just because Halima had already led with my example, I had to think of another one that I wasn't going to confess, but now I will. And I suppose also it harks back to Fiona's point about overemphasizing a particular point. I always come at things with quite a legal viewpoint, and hopefully I try and be broader than that in my role, but inevitably I'm the one who's legal risk. And one of my very first roles a while ago was as a kind of community organisation, and I came at it with a one-sided view of, right, it works better if you change your membership model, then we can change the governing document more easily. We don't have to comply with the Companies Act when we're holding members' meetings, because obviously this was a small membership, but nothing had been complied with, and my head was going, compliance. And I think I tried to go quite heavy with this is the right structure, without actually probably listening to the board members who understood the other dynamics at play about how people felt about being a member of the organisation. I went too hard with my one viewpoint, and I don't think I was open enough. It's a long time ago. I've learnt my lessons, but yeah, some examples. There are plenty more to choose from, I'm sure.
Thank you for your confession. Fiona?
I don't suffer the same problem as Mike. My confession would be I just talk too much. I still do. I try not to, but sometimes I talk when it's not necessary. You do need to express views at boards. Mike made that, very clear. But you can just overtake proceedings. If you're the loudest voice at the table, it might be listened to too much. So you've got to have a word with yourself and talk to yourself rather than at other people. I hope I've learned a little. I have been known to roll my eyes quite a lot as well in previous board life, not currently, about one or two people that was quite visible, and that shouldn't have happened. And hopefully I've learnt my lesson. And I think the third one, and it's something that we do in life, but it's easy to do in the board because you're often with a mix of very different people that you don't mix with elsewhere, perhaps. Is making assumptions. So you assume, and being at the end as somebody who's in the older age spectrum these days, this assumption that I don't know what social media is or how to use a computer, or people talk to me in that tone of voice about it, that whole thing about making assumptions about people. Just because somebody may be quiet and steady in the way they present something doesn't mean they're not interesting or they're not valuable or their point of view isn't going to add something. They're just not as full on as some of the other people. So you learn about that and don't make that assumption, because you've then got to unlearn all your assumptions over a period of time. And that's really a waste of everybody's time.
I think that's a brilliant tip. And we do make assumptions about people, don't we? And then I see that trustees don't always get to know each other. So they can't undo the assumptions because they don't know enough about who they're sitting around the table with. Let's come to Carol's point in the chat, which I think is one I hear about really often. Prattish behaviour of arrogance when, for example, a trustee who is inexperienced in governance but highly skilled, likely from the private sector, joins a board and arrogantly believes that charitable practices are unprofessional, or those who are in the charitable sector are not as skilled as those in the private sector. I mean, I've seen that quite a number of times, that assumption that somehow charities are unprofessional, and that plays out in sometimes a really harmful way, doesn't it? Have any of you experienced that?
I saw that in the chat, and actually thinking about why trustees behave prattishly, because no one goes in and thinks, oh, I'm going to do this thing voluntarily and I'm going to be a real prat about it. I think that's one of the really common causes of prattish behavior, and I've seen it many, many times. And it may not even just be, you know, thinking it's unprofessional, but just not having an understanding about how it works, and almost a respect for the people who are doing this day in, day out, you know. So you'll get some person from the private sector being like, talking to the fundraising person saying, well, have you thought about hitting up the top 5 banks? They'd be great, they give big donations. And you think, well, yeah, we have thought about it. Are you gonna make those introductions? Just a kind of actually coming to it with a naivety. I also think when these adverts go out for trustee roles that say we want, you know, 25 years of board level experience of a FTSE 100, you're going to attract a certain type of person who is used to being listened to and you know, may behave in certain ways that aren't actually conducive to a supportive group dynamic. So yeah, I think that's quite common. Sorry, Fiona.
Yeah.
No, it's interesting because I've come from a private, you know, a commercial corporate background and into boards. And I think, you know, it's incumbent on the individuals to adapt. I have never thought that the people were not professional. In fact, I found exactly the opposite in a way, in that, but equally, I haven't come in with the all people who work for charities are angels concept either. Which I think can also be prattish, that, you know, I'm here to do good. You know, I actually think there's really useful things that I've experienced that I can bring, but I don't think that just walking in and going, well, this is what I've done, so you all need to do it the same way, is the right way of doing it. So I think it's the individual has to be able to adapt. But I agree, I have seen people who just sit there and, you know, it's like, oh, well, you know, you wouldn't be able to do it even if I told you how to.
So let's talk a bit more about why trustees behave badly in the first place. Halima.
Yeah, so I think exactly what you said, Fiona. I think trustees don't realise how much power they have and how, you know, they come in thinking, and I get same with, you know, the kind of the founders, the people who set up organisations to do good. You know, they come thinking, we're here to do something good, we're here to do something different, we're here to make a difference, to work with, you know, often a marginalised community, or a, you know, to improve, you know, equality and reduce inequality. And I think the first time you join a trustee board, I wish someone had sat me down and told me the harm that trustee boards can do and the harm that institutions can do. I mean, we're looking at like the post office scandal, you know, people that are top of organisations, whether they're charities, they're private sector organisations, they're local authorities, the harm that we have the power to do to people. I don't think we should shy away from that. This is not to say to people, don't become a charity trustee, but be aware of why you have a legal responsibility and why you are considered, you know, the top sign off of that organization. It's because it means something. And, you know, being, you know, the line manager, or, you know, managing a director or a set of staff, like really understanding the power that you have. I think trustees don't understand the power that they have. I think they don't understand what they just think they're coming in to do good. And because they're unpaid, there's a sense of, well, whatever I do is enough. You know, I'm not paid like the director. I'm not, like, especially with organizations that I've come from, you know, they're grassroots organizations. Trustees aren't paid. They're often working in, you know, then the people that I often work with on boards, you know, they're maybe not in professional, they're not in jobs where they're being paid a large amount of money. They just don't have the resources. And they feel, you know, undervalued, and they feel that whatever good they do is kind of enough. And I think it's a real misunderstanding of the trustee role, and it's really, really dangerous. And I think if I could change anything, I would say I wish we could somehow pay trustees, or at least provide them with some budgets that they could, have some money to access training, or have some money to take that one day off work, or do things differently. Because I think, sorry to go on, but I think the trustees that are maybe more likely to behave badly are those who aren't resourced, who don't have, a partner who's working full time to support them to maybe work 3 days a week to be a charity trustee, or who just don't have maybe the support network that they need for childcare and other things, I think. Yeah.
Interesting. So you think that the fact it's voluntary really is one of the reasons why trustees behave badly. It's psychologically, there's a barrier there about, I'm a volunteer, so anything goes. But
especially
also,
if you come from a background without, you're not a FTSE 100 CEO, you don't have a job that pays you £100,000 a year, you don't have a nanny, you don't have all of the things that generally middle class white people have that sit on trustee boards, upper middle class people that are sitting on boards have. You don't have those resources when you're working for a small charity or a small organisation.
And you mentioned training, which Carol's been talking about in the chat as well, that absolutely training. And I'll just give a plug now for this is part of Getting On Board's free trustee training programme. Thank you to organisations like Russell Cook that we can put on these sessions for free. It's really interesting to see who comes to these sessions, because I think it isn't the people that you've just described that have resources, Halima. I think it's often the opposite. And I don't know why that is. It might be partly to do with Getting On Board's mission is around inclusion, and perhaps people see that, but also I don't know. I'd love to know whether anybody has any thoughts on that. And perhaps less self-confidence, so therefore you seek to equip yourself. I'm not sure. Let's keep with the why. Mike, why do you think trustees behave badly?
I think almost not quite in contrast to what Halima's saying, but I've come across some trustees who are there for themselves, who want to boost their ego, who want, it's self-aggrandizement, it's point scoring and things like this. I'm a trustee of, and it's important to me as well, and can't see that, and other trustees can't themselves address that or reflect around those sorts of things. So being there for your own importance. And without a doubt, that causes trustees, in fact, causes boards collectively to behave badly.
Thank you. So I'm going to change the order of the questions we thought we were going to answer, panel. And I'm going to move on to, what do we need to do to ensure that trustees are effective in terms of policies, processes, training? What are those kind of things that we need in place to help trustees be less prattish? Who wants to go first on this one?
I suppose I'd be happy to start with, I'd always look at the governing document, and I think it's come up quite a lot, but terms for trustees. And whenever I'm drafting a charity's governing document, often they'll be quite resistant to it at the start. You say, look, it's in the charity governance code, and actually it just stops those awkward conversations, and it does give those people an out. I think you said, Penny, sometimes we make it awkward for people to leave. You have 3-year terms, someone who actually realizes, I don't have the time for this anymore, can leave. And to Mike's point, those people who are doing it for the ego, you can kick them out after 6 years without it being awkward. We often find supporting that a kind of trustees code of conduct, making sure everyone is signing up to that and is very aware from the start. Having robust governance policies in place, such as a conflicts of interest policy, and getting trustees to actually declare their own interests, so that this isn't something that doesn't apply to me. This is something I need to think about what are my potential conflicts. I think robust training is really important. Induction, I think, often gets overlooked. So what does everyone need? It's inevitably going to take some time for trustees to get up to speed. And actually going back to the terms for trustees, I think for effectiveness, you also need to work out retirement by rotation and how that's going to figure out. You can't have a whole board standing down at the same time. So working that through, I think is really important. So training, and then I think an annual audit, and it's not personal, it's something everyone does, and you kind of evaluate your skills. Sometimes getting someone independent in to do that can kind of help you have those conversations and get things out in the open that might be awkward to do face to face. And then I think on the recruitment, having an idea, and that audit feeds into that. So the audit says, you know, we don't have anyone who's got fundraising experience. Well, then you know that the recruitment should be open to that. And it being more of an open recruitment process and less of a, my mate actually is really interested in it, let me hook them up. So I think I've just seen something in the chat. Yeah, so in England and Wales, you actually can't download charities' constitutions from the Charity Commission. You can get them if they're a company from Companies House, but absolutely first thing you should be doing as a trustee is I need to see the governing document and also understand the legal structure, because it means there's a whole nother topic. But if depending on the legal structure, you could be opening yourself up to personal liability. So sorry, I've gone lawyer risk again. So I'll pipe down.
Thank you. A really good, huge list there. And how much do you think so Fiona, Halima or Mike, how much do you think training and induction can help people know what the role is? You know, how much of Prattish behaviour is about people actually just not really understanding what they're there to do, how they relate to, if there's any paid staff, how they relate to staff, how they relate to each other? Halima?
Yeah, 100%. And I think for small charities where service users and beneficiaries become trustees, it's really difficult to understand what is the difference between when I was volunteering and when I was facilitating a session or when I was a service user to when I then become a trustee. And I think I've definitely misunderstood, you know, there are times when you just forget that you are not operationally responsible for this charity. And your role as trustee is so crucially different to being a service user or being a beneficiary. And sometimes it can be fantastic to have, you know, beneficiaries and services on your board, but you've got to really very, very quickly provide the training to explain the difference in role. Because for me, I think that's where it all goes wrong. And I think it starts with, you know, chair of trustees, the chair of trustees having the training, understanding the constitution, understanding the roles and responsibilities, and having what we've been working on is a really good terms of reference, where it's really clear what is the trustee's role, what is the director's role, what is the staff's role, what are the volunteers' roles, and that you're not, you know, stepping on toes. And you know when you're asking those annoying questions at a board meeting, you know, why did we do this event? Well, actually, no, that's not for you. You know, that's a decision the director and the staff and other people made. So for me, it's about really good training and support. So we've just recently been working with the Association of Chairs. So our new chair of trustees has been, I think now has a buddy and a mentor. And I think that's what I needed. I needed someone that I could be like, oh my God, this is going wrong. I need someone external to give me that perspective, because in that box, in that room, in the trustees room, there's one, you know, if the director's attending, that poor director is by themselves when all these trustees think they should be project managers for the charity or they're operational directors, and they're not. And if the 6 or 7 trustees are now decided that they want to interfere in operation, that poor chair is alone to be like, actually, this isn't your job. I mean, how can they have those kind of conversations? How can they say those things in a room where they're really dominated by potentially a group of trustees that just don't get what their job is? Yeah, I think it's just a spell for disaster.
Absolutely. And I guess, and I'm going to come to you, Mike, but just to say that, you know, some people here might be trustees of charities with no staff. And then, of course, you are also operational. And then you might get your first member of staff and the line moves, doesn't it? Even for organisations that have had staff for quite some time, the line really moves depending on, are we in crisis? Are we having a pandemic at the moment? Are we having a funding crisis? Are staff leaving? As to how operational we need to be. So even with that understanding that trustees are technically not, you know, are leadership and strategic rather than operational, it's really hard to know where the line is at any one moment.
Yeah, I mean, I often talk about having that, particularly in small charities without staff or with few staff at all. It's almost having those 2 hats and wearing those 2 hats at different times and understanding that. What I was going to come back, because Halima said one of the words I've just been thinking about, which is buddying. Ideally, in terms of trustee induction, trustee recruitment, recruiting more than one at a time, having 2 people, if possible, not always possible in some organisations, but having 2 people that can themselves say, why is he always asking those stupid questions, or why are we doing it like that, supporting each other, or even buddying from outside with other charities, finding somebody else who's in the same situation, or ideally, if you can do it, mentoring someone that will help you through that as well. But having someone to ask those almost seemingly stupid questions. And I suppose the other thing that occurred to me, we're talking about recruiting and inducting trustees. We're not giving trustees who are, come on, we are the highest level decision makers there. We're not giving them, us, the same opportunities we would give to staff. We wouldn't recruit a CEO without a role description and some background papers and probably last year's annual report and the constitution and the minutes of the last meeting. We should be giving those as packs or availability. So constitution, governing document, AGM, last 3 minutes, financial reports, almost a whole list of things. I mean, I'm sometimes worried I'm giving too much, but I'd rather have too much there. And people say, well, actually calm down a little bit, but please, let's see it.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. So Fiona, I'm going to come to you. So far in terms of processes and procedures that we think we need to have in place, we've got terms of office, rotating rather than everybody leaving at once. We've got code of conduct for trustees. We've got certain sorts of governance policies like conflict of interest policies, annual audits of what we need on our board, and then followed by open recruitment to fill those gaps, buddying, stroke somebody to ask stupid questions to, recruiting more than one trustee at a time so people aren't out on a limb, training, and induction, including key documents such as governing document. Andrew in the chat saying she's a new trustee and she's asked for it and she's not getting it, but also things like role descriptions. Fiona, is there anything you'd add to that list?
I think the only thing that I would add is that it's really important to understand that the chair is not just another trustee, that the chair has a very specific role, and that role is very strong in terms of governance. And the chair should be doing an appraisal, and I use the word appraisal rather than some fluffy word that isn't, of every trustee. And in turn, there needs to be, and this is what the Charity Commission recommends, it's not easy. I'm lucky, I've done them for years in business, but it's not easy to do. Get some help, get some buddying, get some mentoring or whatever. But it's really important that's done, because it actually gives you a moment when you can say, we're having this meeting, you can tell me things, but also I need to tell you this. And it's a lot easier to do that than to call it out in a meeting or to call it out some other time when it can sound petty, because there's a structure around it. So I think that's very important, and that the board has regular audits as well about its performance.
Yeah.
Ideally conducted by external people every 2 or 3 years, but there's a cost in that. It depends on the size of the charity.
Yeah.
But really it's about, and your governance document isn't just the constitution, the mission or whatever. It's your day-to-day paperwork written in plain English, not, charity language that often constitutions are written in, but just plain English. Who does what? What are the processes?
Yeah.
And make sure that everybody's aware of that and following it.
Great, thank you. And I'm just going to add one more, but bearing in mind what Halima said about, you'd like to see trustees paid, paying expenses. So the thing that we can do, that should be absolutely standard and most charities don't do. So paying expenses to equip people to be able to, at least to that extent, get to meetings and not be out of pocket. Right, we've got 7 minutes left. We've still got loads to crack through. I'd like us to start talking about, what do we do? What if we're in a board meeting and we're seeing prattish behaviour, and it isn't us, because we can do something about it if it's ourselves. What do we do about it? So let's take this from 2 angles. What can we do if we are a trustee alongside the Prat? And what can we do if we're a member of staff of that charity seeing prattish behaviour? Because I think the strategies are probably different. Fiona, can we start with you?
Well, I would say if you're a trustee, you should talk to your chair. It's really down to I would hope that there's a good relationship and that works. If it doesn't and everything's broken down, I think we need another Zoom for that. But assuming that it's working, you need to express that you're concerned about this. You talk to the chair and the chair needs to tackle it. I think if you're a member of staff, you need to talk to and you're not the lead member, the chief executive, you need to talk to them, and they need to discuss it to the chair, because the chair chief executive dynamic is absolutely critical. That may not always work, because it may be the chair that's a problem, but if it isn't, you can resolve a lot of problems that way. So that would be my first point of call, aware that we've got limited time.
Thank you. Who else wants to come in with other tips about what to do when you see prattish behaviour? Who wants to go next? Pippa, shall we come to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd second what Fiona says. I think it's one of those things, though. It is quite hard to bring up without, as you said, seeming petty. So it's having those procedures in place so that you can deal with them on a, it's going to probably end up annual. Ideally, it would be more frequent than that, but in a kind of safer space where it feels non-judgmental and it feels less like a personal attack, whether it's as part of an appraisal, which is a great suggestion. As you say, you've got those calendarized. This isn't you said that thing an hour ago and that really upset me, because I think it is quite hard to call out prattish behaviour, and the question actually for me reinforces how important it is to have policies and procedures in place to prevent them in the first place, but then also allow you to just deal with them in a kind of almost neutral way, rather than having to call them out on the day, because I think we all know there are some personalities that would be fine in doing that and some personalities that won't, and the trustees who are the people who would not feel comfortable raising things shouldn't be punished for that.
And actually, I'm going to come to you next, Halima, but I was really struck with Halima and Pippa's example around maternity leave, that actually that's not, that's a certain sort of prattish behaviour where actually the trustees around you could have given you more support. So in a sense, it's not like saying, Pippa, Halima, you're behaving really badly. It's saying, look, we can see that actually you've probably got too much on your plate to perhaps be a trustee at the moment. Can somebody step in? Would you like to step off the board for a while? Would you like to perhaps have a co-chair? So in a sense, it's not always calling out in an aggressive kind of in your face way, is it? Sometimes it's actually looking out for somebody and realizing that actually maybe they're struggling with something. Halima, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about this a lot, about the interdependencies between like trustees, and how, a chair is not always going to have the capacity to do and to be on the ball all the time and to be there for those conversations. Sometimes there are safeguarding issues, and your chair's on holiday, your chair's not around. And so I think how you build that interdependency between trustees, and I think, having a vice chair, I would really love to see. So we offer supervision to our director. So they have someone that they can kind of almost like, not quite counselling, but kind of a supervisory, and someone external that we pay to provide supervision. And we give them a budget. And I would love to see that we could give that to our chair of trustees. So could they, they've got someone that they can go and talk to provide that sort of sense of care and like a bit of almost like coaching, like, is this the right role for you? And like, to give that external perspective. Because I think if I look at the situation that I was in, I mean, it was literally 2020, it was pandemic, everyone was stretched. Everyone was desperately trying to understand what their own kind of work life was going to look like. So yeah, it's really difficult.
Thank you. I'm going to have to wrap us up, I'm afraid. We could keep going. Mike, I'm going to come to you because you didn't get to answer that question. I'm going to come to you for one final tip. What can trustees do to check their own behaviour?
I think try and become more self-aware, or use those sorts of skills, that self-reflection, that am I doing this well, or can I get some feedback to hear about this, and perform in that sort of, and the word I use all the time is collective together. Let's do this together.
Thank you all so much. That was an absolutely wonderful conversation, really, really constructive. Thank you all. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to pass now to Fiona, who's going to close us off.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pippa, Halima, Mike, Fiona, and of course Penny. That was so interesting. I picked up lots and lots of tips myself there. And thank you very much to everyone who came and got involved in the chat. There were some really interesting comments for all of us to think about. I have just put some stuff into the chat, so please fill in our evaluation form. I think I put it in twice. It really does help us to deliver on our impact and make ourselves better, so super important. Very finally, thank you very much to Sir Russell Cook They've been absolutely brilliant in supporting us. If you enjoyed this session and are able to make a donation, please do so. We do have our sponsors and they're absolutely amazing, but everything helps us to make sure that we keep the programme free and deliver as much impact as we can to as many people as we can accessibly. And finally, things that we have going on elsewhere, please check out the rest of our trustee learning programme. There's a link in the chat to our Eventbrite page. You can go to our website and download our free guides and resources. Lots of the things that we were talking about that have been spoken about. We've got tips contained within our guides that can help you on recruitment, inclusion, setting up board audits, and so on. Early birds would like to, if you'd like to book weekly pass to our Festival of Trusteeship, which is happening 4th to 8th November. Get your tickets now, £15. Yeah. Check out our website for anything else, and please sign up to our newsletter to keep up to date with topical issues and find out about forthcoming sessions. And I think I've managed to cram everything in about a minute and a half, so I shall stop. Thank you very much.
Excellent speed talking, Fiona. Thank you all so much. I hope you all have a lovely evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.